Welcome to the Lucid Horizon. This is a series of talks that we're having with Professor Hassan Mansour about economic growth and economic development. In the last four programs, we covered the general introduction about what economic growth and what economic developments are and what's the relationship between the two and whether they are desirable and how it has happened in other countries in the world. In this program, we are going to dedicate ourselves specifically to the model of socioeconomic development for Iran. And we are having a world expert on the economy of Iran, Professor Mansour, to help us to understand all these issues about this model. Professor Mansour, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Professor Kangarlu. I'm happy to be with you.
We're very happy to have you. Could you first give us a brief and concise definition of the problematics of what we're going to be talking about?
Well, so far, Professor Kangarlu, we've been talking about in 4 episodes about the question of growth and economics. Why are we dealing with this question? A process in which our nation has entered about 110-15 years ago with the Constitutionalist Revolution. It was entering of an archaic society into the modern world. So great efforts in nationalist scale has been spared in order to achieve this goal. But Constitutional Revolution did not succeed 100% in providing development for the nation. So in a word, I would say it failed. Later on, we have the regime change and the government of the benevolent or not dictator in Iran, Reza Shah, and his efforts to modernize the country. We did achieve certain stages of modernization and economic growth, but again, development as defined, we could not achieve. Again, I would say we failed in attaining the goals of development. Later on, we have some 37 years of reign of Mohammad Reza Shah, who in different phases of his governments, lenient or hard dictatorship, introduced lots of measures for economic growth. Growth was achieved, but development was not fully achieved. Again, I would say, looking back and summing up, that all these 3 efforts have to a great extent failed in attaining the goals of development. So this becomes a question, why are we failing? What is this that we want to achieve? So this is our problem. In order to do that, we study Iranian economy, Iranian society, and look at other nations, see how they have done. But this is the problem we are at, that we have been trying to achieve development, but we have so far failed. The final stage, which was the new regime of Islamic government. This regime had some strong points that dictatorships didn't have. It started with the populist movement, popular support. So those who believe that the role of the populace is a determining factor in providing development would have expected that this regime would provide development. But no, it is not correct, because to begin with, development was not in the agenda of this government at all. They didn't want to. But what they wanted to was the growth. They wanted to have economic growth, because no government, being democratic or dictatorial, they don't want to be poor, they want to be rich. So this is the growth part. They wanted to achieve growth, but not development, which requires democracy, freedom, and elevation of culture, all right? But did they achieve even growth, which is the preliminary part of development? The answer is no, because you look at these 42 years, the national per capita income of every Iranian now is less than 2/3 of the year revolution took place. So they even failed in providing growth. This is our problem. that we're facing.
So let me unpack this in the layman's language. Is it true to say that growth is really a simple fact of the rate of expansion of the economy, but between the growth and development exists the policies and the politics of the country? So growth can happen at the government level, but development has to happen at the people's level. And if there is not a direct flow of resources and revenues from the government to the people, something that happens in democracies, growth cannot translate into development. Is that an accurate assessment and summary of what you said?
Well, the idea is quite accurate, yes. The point is, growth takes place within the same structure. It deepens it, but the structure doesn't change. So economic structure, social structure, and social norms, to a great extent, they remain intact, but productivity increases, some technologies improves, and we get more outputs to inputs. So this brings about an increase of GDP. But development requires something much deeper. And the question is, historically looking back at it, the nations who have achieved development, they have first ordered their houses before they embarked on the road of development. So look at tens of examples. Europe, England, Germany, France, Russia, China, to a great extent, all of them, they have ordered, China is a different example which we have dealt separately, but they have ordered their houses in terms of reforming the elements which can stop and impede the process of growth and development. They have reformed a religion. So they started the process of their development on the basis of a reformed religion. So Catholicism gave way to Protestantism with all ethics. Ethics changed, aesthetics changed, and the roads to development were paved. While a country like Iran, which starts its process of growth and development in 20th century, end of 19th century, this country has a problem or problems which the other countries who have achieved development didn't have. Because these countries have not dealt with impediments of development. They haven't reformed their religion. They have not laid the ground for Renaissance. And this is a main thing which comes up again and again. So in the middle of the road, hurdles grow and they stop the process. This is what we have felt numerous times, especially at the advent of Islamic Revolution, where growth was achieved. We were kind of at a point of taking off towards development. And then these hurdles became so strong that it stopped the whole process and thwarted it, changed the course.
Is it accurate to say that one measure of development is the diversity of the sources of income and the industries that provide the main sources of foreign exchange? For instance, in most of the dictatorial governments and dictatorial regimes, it seems to me that the economy is a single source economy, whether it's Iran or Russia or Venezuela or all the oil producing countries. There is really not a lot of diversity in the sources of income, in the export at least. And one of the reasons that this, it seems to me that in these countries, mostly dictatorial, I mean, Russia might call itself a democracy, but not democracy with this Western standards. Still, in spite of the fact that it has a very well-developed industry, at least aerospace industry and the military industry, and probably pharmaceutical industry, but still oil remains to be the #1 source of income for Russia. And that seems to be the trademark and the signature of all the dictatorships, that they don't allow the kind of freedom and the open society that results in the flourishing of all the human resources and that can really thrive and produce diversified sources of income. One area that really is of interest to me is the entertainment industry. That, you know, in the Western world, entertainment industry is a thriving industry and a big industry, but none of the dictatorships have been able to establish an entertainment industry that's capable of producing, generating foreign exchange and revenues, major revenues from export of the products. And it seems to me that there is some kind of a measure of development in the diversity of the sources of economic revenue. Is that accurate?
Yes, you're right. You've raised numerous questions. A comparison of socialist systems with the market systems will totally different simply because they had different definitions of wealth. Say, for example, under Stalin regime, under socialist Soviet regime, the nation, the wealth originated by definition from heavy industry, and the producers of that wealth were the workers who worked in those industries, and it was the living labor in contrast to dead labor. The dead labor is the labor which is crystallized within capital, the structures of capital. So according to Marx's definition, it was the living labor which produced the surplus value. This even brings about a change in their accounting, national accounting system. Instead of national accounting that we know in the West, they had the system of balances, which mean the material balances. This means ingredients of inputs should be in harmony with each other. Once we produce something, we know that to produce a car, we need this percentage of this, that percentage of that. So we need to only care for the harmony of these elements in order to have economic equilibrium. In their national accounting, we did not count services as productive. So your job as a professor of physics, mine as an economist, a nurse, a pilot, a computer scientist, a teacher, a police, they were by definition called parasitic. So they were not part of GDP. Their market was not market oriented. Their production was not market oriented. So there was always, without exception, great deal of disharmony and disequilibrium in the markets. It means goods which came into the market, they were not sufficient, or they were more than sufficient and they were wasted. There was no market system. So that's it. That becomes a different cup of tea to deal with Soviet economy. But yes, it is correct that diversification of production is a rule. The more grown economy becomes diverse, and it becomes a network of technology. Even the science and technology today grows as a network. It means that once you have your discoveries in MRI, it also affects economic research. We use the same techniques. So any field of science feeds other fields of science. So it becomes a diversified economy. But I think these are the secondary questions.
Mm-hmm.
The primary question is, do we have a basis for industrial society? For industrial society, we have a culture, norms, values, which beds for that industry. To be industrious, we need industrious people, very hardworking, meticulous people, and a system who observes and regulates that meticulous production. This historically was achieved in Western society. You read any great theoretician in this field, after Reformation was achieved. So under Catholicism, it was not possible. Look at the Islamic countries. More than 1 billion people in about 40 and odd countries. None of them have become industrial. They may take branches of industry and imitate it, try to emulate it, but they haven't become industrial societies. Industrial society requires industrial man. Industrial man requires hardworking, conscientious workings in which work itself is called as a merit. Production is defined as the aim of life. So this society was created after Protestant ethics took over in Western countries. So we need some background fundamentals, foundations for it. On the foundations, then we decide which system we have. The problem that we face in Iran is, well, we have a we have a basis to start, which is mixed, which means we have some elements of modern world in the system, but we have some elements from the archaic world which would stop and impede our growth. Otherwise, we would not have given way to Islamic rule of the clergy after having experienced some 50 years of growth. No, we did experience growth. We did achieve growth, but at the height of our growth of 11% for about more than a decade of growth, we gave way to the slogans and populist mottos of Mr. Khomeini. So we stop there. So
Yes.
this is the main thing. Yes, we need for development, we need some basis, and our problems is in the basis because we do not have the cultural norms and values for that society because we haven't gone through Renaissance and Reformation, which we've got to deal with it parallel to our industrialization, which makes our task much more difficult than the task of the, say, British industry.
Very well. So with all of this, we can go back to continuing our discussion about development. And at this point, let me ask you whether development is a necessity, is a must, or is a choice? Why should countries want to develop?
Well, this is a very interesting question. Yes. We've really got to decide about it. Do we really want, having a look at our history, that we failed 3 times? Now, do we really want to achieve development? We've got to know what is that we want to achieve. The costs we pay are immediate. The fruits we expect are far-fetched in the future history. It's an epic task to start because we've got to know what the process involves. Once we start the process of development, we are starting to deconfigure our social structure. Once we start deconfiguration, then we get disharmonies and disequilibria, which will creep into our system. Let me give you an example in order to clarify this. Iranian population has been about 9 million, around 9 million, for about a century, 19th century. This stability was there. It periods, of course, famines and so on, that reduced again, became about 7, 8, 9 million. So by the end of the century, we had 9 million population. Birth rate was very high, about 5%. Death rate was very high, about 5%. So death rates will offset birth rates and the population will remain stable. The very first phases of reform starts with introduction of simple medication like DDC. Once we introduce in society, then the rate of children dying of dysentery goes down. Once death rate falls, birth rate doesn't fall. Birth rate continues. In about 40 years, population grows 15 million. From 9 million, 15 million. But does the food production grow at the same rate? No. Production doesn't grow at the same rate. Then we may get hunger in society, starvation in society, simply because we have introduced DDT as a medication and we have reduced the death rate. So in the beginning, we have a harmony between different elements, but these different elements in society have different rates and speeds. We start changing education and bringing about new generations of people, of workers, of technicians. In the meantime, social norms, social ethics, social morality, religion do not change with the same speed. Once your children grow and they become kind of modernized in modern schools, your religious leaders do not grow. So they say that these schools are anti-religious and they make a revolt against it. This is what we have experienced in our history. So this kind of divergence would bring about great deal of problems. Well, sociologists have studied this problem. For example, George Gurvitch studies about 7 lines of different times in society, which are not of the same speed. And this causes divergence once the process of growth starts. So any leader in development must be aware already what the problem is involved and how we are going to deal with that. Planning. Say, for example, another example, and I stopped answering this question. Industrialization starts in Iran by assembling foreign products in Iran, car industry, and so on and so forth. New workers are required, and they come from mostly countryside. Countryside people come, about 4 million people arrive in Tehran alone, and they become slum dwellers. The question is why? Because the speed of absorption of these workers in the industries around Tehran is not comparable to the speed of their immigration from the countryside. And once they arrive them, we haven't built the necessary institutions. Housing is not adequate for them. Schools are not there. And social institutions to provide culture and leisure for those people are not there. This is why they become slum dwellers who are potentially a prey for the populist propaganda. So the only cultural institution for them becomes mosques and the vulgar films. And this is why they become an army against the industrial process which has started and leads to revolution. So these are the kind of disparities that any leader of development must be aware of before starting.
And some of the development that happened during the latter part of the Mohammad Reza Shah's reign in Iran, specifically what happened in the context of the White Revolution, the land reform, and the contribution partnership between the workers and in the interests and the profits of the factories and so on and so forth. There were so many different elements, 6 or 7 different elements in the White Revolution. But one specific one which seemed to have caused a lot of outcry from the religious community was the emancipation of women and the women's suffrage, women's right to vote. So is this one of those cases where development comes into clash with the cultural norms and the religious norms of society, and eventually the economic development gets arrested because of the consequence of its development and its conflict with the religion and the culture of society?
Exactly, you're quite right. Yes, process of growth, not even talking about development, process of growth requires modern schools, colleges of technology, students, teachers, modern teaching, and relations, of course, with modern centers in the world and the world. So we get new generations of schools. These new generation of schools who come from both Tehran and from other cities in Iran, they settle in Tehran. They form their own families. Once they form their families, they are not within the extended family. They become a nucleus family, a husband, wife, and children. So they develop a different norm with dealing with each other. So the status of man and women, they change. They, in the eyes of society, even gradually starts to change. Women acquire some liberty to move, to drive their cars, to go to their work and come back and be equally respected. Then comes the necessity for the law to recognize it. Then equality of women, the right for women's suffrage, that is ratified. And here, the norms of society revolts. And in the forefront of this revolt, you have the clergy of a non-reformed religion. So reformed religion, which is already tamed in the West, it does not provide any problem. But in these countries, in any, look at Iran, look at a stronger degree of resistance. You look at Pakistan. Anything modern, anything new will be acted against very strongly by the Pakistani clergy. And they would look at the writers of Pakistan, look at professors of Pakistan, look at what's happening in the country. So look at madrasa system, which is built in the country and already takes tens of millions of children under its custody. And look at what they teach in madrasa systems in Pakistan. So this is a real danger. This brings us to another very sensitive question. Is Pakistan a democracy? Yes, it is. Democracy in the narrow sense of the word is elections. They have elections. They do elect their leaders. But in case you have a republic or monarchy, doesn't matter, on the context of an unreformed society, you do not lead to development. So the primary thing to do is to deal with that foundation. That's to bring about reform. So it should be one of the tasks parallel to the process of development, which of course, look at what happened Benazir Bhutto, or even her father, Bhutto, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Those were the representative of modernization for Pakistan. They were both killed. So this resistance can be very aggressive. So dealing with development in the context of an archaic culture has its own complications, which England or France or Russia did not face in their process of development.
Very well. So we talked about a little bit. We talked about the prerequisites of development and some measures of development, and we kind of alluded into the diversified economy as one of the standards for development, perhaps emancipation of women as another source, and probably democracy. But what do you consider to be the prerequisites of development?
We've just mentioned that once we want to embark on this road, we've got to see that it is a difficult process, costly process. Costs are already to be made. Returns are in the future. But it is a legendary process. It's an epic moment. Once we decide that, yes, we want to go that road, because otherwise, if we don't want to go, it means that we are going to be one of the forgotten species in history. And is it a choice? No, we are going to be subjected to history. We're not going to be the actors of history. So there is no way. It is not an option. Yes, in the world that we're living in, to become modernized and reformed is not a choice. We have to do it. But in order to do that, we need to begin with to be determined that we know what the road is, we want to achieve it. Secondly, what do we need? I will only mention the titles. On each of these titles, of course, books can be written with no exaggeration. Once we decide on the road of development, the first question is that we need to provide the necessary institutions for it. And the first institution is a modern and clean state who is determined to provide for growth and development. So without a strong will from a government who's clean, it means not a corrupt government. A government who's clean and determined to provide growth. That's the first prerequisite for achieving development. The second would be an absolute separation between the religion, especially if the religion is not reformed, and the state. This is the first stage. The first stage was called secularism. The second stage is being laïque. But I'm now talking about the preliminary stage of secularism. It is absolute separation between state and religion. And of course, this means religious people are free to have their religion. No interference in personal freedoms. But religion has no way in the law books or institutions of government.
So that's what you consider. Go ahead.
The next one, which is going to be implemented and must be implemented parallel to it, is a clean and modern judiciary. Without a modern judiciary, which is the guarantor of rights and contracts, you do not have the growth. In any country which achieves development, you have a clean judiciary system. So to separate judiciary from religion and to keep it clean, active, and quick, and cheap enough, accessible to people. So to defend their rights and to enforce contracts. Then we need some infrastructure. Infrastructure of roads, railroads, networks, internet networks, and all the rest of it. Without which national capital would not exist, and without national capital, capital formation for enterprises will not be possible, and without capital, production will not take place. So this is the basis of it, and it has got to be provided by the governments of the country. Then we need a legal network or a virtual infrastructure, a legal infrastructure of incentives for investment. Of course, it comes with safety, security of investment, and a system of clean market which makes investment profitable. And government has got to be the guarantor, and judiciary has got to be guarantor of the contracts. In order to make the country a haven for investment, for national investment and international investment, in order to reap the benefits of comparative advantages in the world. This is, any country is doing it, even China is doing it. An imminent reform of banking system and monetary system. This becomes the most necessary in a country where the banking system has been corrupted and paralyzed. So it is a must to provide a monetary system which really works and responds to monetary incentives. Once you have money market, once you have a market in which the rates of interest are determined in the market, the rates of your exchanges determined in the market. So we need a banking system, a monetary system, which responds to monetary incentives of central bank. Otherwise, central bank becomes totally useless, as it has already become. Parallel to all this, reform of educational system. We do have a strong infrastructure in education, elementary schools, secondary schools, universities, but the quality is deplorable. Quality is deplorable. We have studied it, and I was among the members of Swedish Ministry of Science in evaluating Iranian degrees, in which we realized we made comparison, we provided data banks in order to compare what an Iranian engineer knows about compared to its Swedish counterpart, what Iranian doctor, dentist, philosopher, sociologist, and so on and so forth. There are great many things that they do study and they're totally useless. Waste of energy and time. They're not counted. You teach them what lots of jurisprudence, and there's no use comparing to an education system which is effective and goal-oriented like the Swedish one. It doesn't count. Even you come to concrete fields like a dentist. I remember that once, now it has changed, of course, it was decided that an Iranian dentist is equal to the second-year student in Sweden. This was deplorable. So we need a total reform of this education system. We need a reform of social media. We have a strong backbone of media in Iran, yet media do not exist in lack of freedom. We need freedom, equality, responsibility, and correct judiciary. So to make them responsible, but to leave them free. Then an open economy to the world, so that we can have access to the markets of the world and take the benefits of comparative advantages that our economy has. And finally, we require the mobilization of all sources of ideas and thoughts like think tanks, creation of modern think tanks, which can provide lots of information and models for our economic growth and social development. So these are some of the institutions which are necessary, and any leader of economic development process must be totally aware of these requirements.
So in your opinion, if this recipe that you just listed for development is at the disposal of a government like the Islamic government in Iran, and at the same time, they are confronted with this existential threat of being overthrown violently by their population as a result of the economic mismanagement, why, in your opinion, they are not implementing these very simple recipes to at least save their own heads?
The question of vested interests and structures. In the society and economy, it is not the will of the individuals which counts, but the institutions which stabilize and set norms. These institutions which grow parallel to the growth of in the case of Iran revolution, they have their own vested interests. So once we talk about incompetence, and everybody mentions that the government has been very incompetent, but they have not been very incompetent providing their own wealth. They've taken care of it, using all the means. Here we come to another interesting question. The question of the micro and macro in economics. It is not necessarily concomitant, necessarily the same. People, a group of people, some groups of people may gain, a majority of people may lose. The contradictions between micro and macro are very, very glaring. And even conceptually, it's a different story I cannot enter in this talk, but it requires, I've written separate articles on it. There are things in it which micro means household companies. Hundreds of companies may grow, as they do in Setad Ejrai. There are hundreds of companies, and they grow and they become multimillionaires. But does it make national economy rich? No, they make national economy poorer. So once you have these vested interests, and the vested interest is backed by a partial power of the government. I call it partial because the power which has got to be the power of the nation is not the power of the nation. It is the power of a group of ruling elite, of the revolution guards, of the security, and they take care of their own interests. And this is why they cannot adapt themselves to the requirements of national interests and even provide security for themselves. They provide their own good, their own interest, but running the peril of national dissent.
Well, in that regard, they've been doing a very good job. They've created tremendous amount of national dissent, and they've highly mismanaged the economy. And considering that, an ideological government like the Islamic Republic considers its military might, or at least developing some military muscles, to fence off their foreign competition, specifically the kind of competition they have established in the region with Saudi Arabia and Israel and recently Turkey, to really face off this massive amount of disenchantment and dissatisfaction that they've created in the region. They must develop some kind of a domestic military technology, and they have invested immensely in nuclear enrichment. And there are different estimations as to how much the government has invested in the nuclear enrichment, anywhere from $500 billion to $1,000 billion of investment over the last 20 years. This amount of money could really be spent on the infrastructure to really flourish the economy and reduce the tension between the regime and the people, that will really kind of stabilize the government and prevent its demise. But apparently the ideology, governments, even the governments as corrupt as the Islamic Republic, as you mentioned, that all these other institutions, all the government officials are really pursuing their own personal interests. And in pursuing that, they really leave a vast majority of the populace out in the cold. And that has created a lot of dissatisfaction. But they seem to be completely in oblivion about this fact. And they keep on pushing for their own military might, development of the domestic military resources and military industry, and the arming and the financing and the training of all their cronies and the proxies in the region. And Iran continues becoming more and more and more impoverished. And I mean, while this regime is heading for the cliff, I'm still in awe. How come they don't see that if they develop some models of economic development that you're advising here, they could, as I said, they could really save their own future, at least the future of the families that they have to exist and they have to live in that country. But apparently the drive and the zeal for the ideology and the pursuit of whatever their ideals are have made them completely blind to the simple economy that you're presenting here.
Well, in the case of Islamic Republic, I think this is a question of the definitions, very first definitions from its constitution. Do we have a country? According to the constitution, no. Islam doesn't have a country. Islam belongs to the whole world. So where's our country? Our country is wherever Muslims are. Is there a nation? No. If you don't have a nation, you don't have national interest. So where goes our priorities? Priorities is taking care of any Muslim faction which supports us, even non-Muslim factions which supports our cause. That's why we spread into Yemen, Lebanon, Afghanistan, and Syria, and so on and so forth. Africa, Latin America. The question of priorities. How do we define a priority? Well, in order to reach those areas, of course, you need some military might. That becomes your priority. And then, how to deal with the dissent inside? Well, if you cannot reform and satisfy, then you can suppress. So suppression becomes the main tool. And once you step on that road, every measure you take invigorates your previous stance, and you become stronger in suppressing people. You become more determined in suppressing people. So this is the wrong path which starts, and of course, it changes the field into a tug of war between the will of the people and will of the rulers, which are the rulers of a part of the people. This takes us to the realm of political science. But economically, we're talking about national economy. We talk about national growth, national development. What is national? And indeed, the world doesn't allow you to become non-national and go beyond, go to communities. This is why the Islamic Republic is confronted with so great resistance in the world and so many sanctions. Because at least on the ground of Westphalia treaties, we have definition of nations and countries. You cannot go beyond it. And if you go beyond it, you cannot expect others to respect your territory and your boundaries. This is something which has been distorted by the Constitution of Islamic Republic. But anyway, there is a big and great nation to be taken care of. And if they cannot meet, of course, they're going to be responsible for the same nation, which may lead us to an unfortunate confrontation. But so far, all the resources you mentioned, look at the current situation of economy in Iran. About 60 million out of 83 million people are in need of food help, which means that they are below the poverty line. How can one explain in a country, in a resource-rich country, with intelligent and young working people, how can you justify this? This is only justified when you look at it, look at the ideology by which the regime is working. You can explain according to those tenets of the ideology, you can explain. Your first priority goes to Palestine, even if Palestine itself doesn't want that kind of liberation that you want. This is the dichotomy, this is the contrast that we have between a regime and the realities of economy and politics in a country.
Thank you very much for a very lucid explanation of these very fundamental issues and the issues that our country and our society and our people are wrestling with. And we're hoping that, with the clarifications that you're making, at least the people, it can raise the demand of the people and the government officials in order to cause some kind of a unity and through understanding and through education of economy and the economic principles, with the unique aspect of Iranian economy and how Iran can really find its way through the families of nations to ultimate freedom and a democratic and open society. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of this episode and we have to leave it off there. And although I have a lot more questions that remains to be discussed in our next episode of Lucid Horizon. And with that, I thank you very much once again for agreeing to participate and give your time to us generously. And I hope to see you in our next episode.
Thank you very much indeed. It's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Professor Kangarlu.
Thank you.